They rescued a wounded beast, not knowing it belonged to the mighty Baroness. The sun burned high over the cracked plains of Arctera, a desert world forgotten by most of the galaxy. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, carried by a wind that never seemed to rest. Kale Torin adjusted the scarf over his mouth, squinting through the haze. His boots crunched against the brittle ground as he hauled his salvage sled behind him. A scavenger by trade, Kale had spent years picking through the bones of wrecked ships and abandoned colonies. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him alive. Humans like him didn't get fancy jobs in the glittering cities of the core systems. Out here, on the edge of nowhere, he made his own rules. He spotted it then, a glint of metal half buried in a dune. Another wreck. Kale's heart quickened. Most crashes on Arctera were old, stripped clean by time or other scavengers, but this one looked fresh. The hull was sleek, not rusted, with curves that didn't match any human design he knew. Alien tech. Dangerous, maybe, but valuable. He dropped the sled's reins and approached, his gloved hands tightening around the pry bar at his belt. The ship was small, a shuttle maybe, its side torn open like something had clawed its way out, or in. Kale stepped closer, peering into the shadowy interior. That's when he heard it, a low, rattling sound, like air escaping a broken pipe. He froze. The sound came again, weaker this time, followed by a faint scrape. Something was alive in there. His first instinct was to back away. Arctera's wildlife wasn't friendly, sand vipers and rock lizards had nearly ended him more than once. But this didn't sound like a beast hunting for a meal. It sounded hurt. Against his better judgment, Kale climbed through the jagged hole. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt circuits and something sharper, like blood. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw it, a creature sprawled across the floor. It was big, nearly as long as Kale was tall, with a body like a mix between a wolf and a lizard. Its scales shimmered faintly, shifting colors from deep blue to silver, even in the weak light. One of its legs was bent at a wrong angle, and a gash ran along its side, leaking a dark, oily fluid. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Kale knelt beside it, careful not to get too close. The creature's eyes cracked open, glowing faintly green, and fixed on him. There was no growl, no snap of teeth, just a tired, almost pleading look. Kale's mind raced. He'd seen plenty of alien species pass through trading posts, but nothing like this. It wasn't in any database he'd ever hacked into. Still, he couldn't just leave it here to die. He'd always had a soft spot for strays, ever since he was a kid scavenging with his dad on Earth's ruined outskirts. "All right, buddy," he muttered, pulling his pack off his shoulder. "Let's see if I can keep you breathing." He didn't have a fancy medkit, just a scavenged set of tools, some bandages, and a tube of sealant gel he'd bartered for at a junk port. The gash was deep, but the bleeding had slowed. Kale tore a strip from his scarf, doused it with water from his canteen, and pressed it against the wound. The creature flinched but didn't fight him. Its scales felt cool under his hands, smoother than he'd expected. He worked fast, cleaning the injury with what little he had. The broken leg was trickier. He rigged a splint from a metal shard he pried off the ship's wall, binding it with cord from his sled. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. The creature watched him the whole time, its eyes never leaving his face. There was something in that gaze, something sharp, like it understood more than it should. By the time Kale finished, the sun was dipping low, painting the desert gold. He sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. The creature's breathing was steadier now, though it still couldn't stand. "You're tougher than you look," he said, half to himself. He decided to call it Rift, after the glowing cracks in its scales that caught the light like a shattered mirror. Kale was about to figure out how to move Rift to his sled when a shadow passed overhead. He scrambled out of the wreck, shielding his eyes against the glare. 3 ships hovered above, sleek and black, their engines humming a deep, menacing note. They weren't human, too angular, too quiet. Alien. Cale's stomach tightened. Ships like that didn't come to Arcterra for sightseeing. They were looking for something. He ducked back inside, heart pounding. Rift let out a soft, urgent chirp, its head lifting slightly. You know who they are, don't you? Cale whispered. The creature's eyes flicked toward the sky, then back to him. Cale didn't have time to think it through. He grabbed his pack and started rigging a harness from the sled straps. If those ships were after Rift, he wasn't about to let them find it, not after all the work he'd put in. The ships descended, kicking up clouds of sand as they landed a few hundred yards away. Cale worked faster, looping the harness around Rift's body. The creature didn't resist, even helped by shifting its weight when he tugged. Good boy, or girl, whatever you are, he said, managing a grin despite the panic clawing at his chest. Voices echoed outside, sharp and guttural, in a language Cale didn't recognize. He peeked through the hole in the hull. Figures in dark armor were spreading out, scanning the ground with handheld devices. They were closing in. Cale tightened the harness and pulled Rift toward the back of the wreck, where a smaller tear in the metal led to a shallow ravine. It wasn't much cover, but it was something. He dragged Rift out, keeping low as the voices grew louder. The creature was heavy, but adrenaline gave Cale strength he didn't know he had. They slid into the ravine just as a beam of light swept over the wreck. Cale pressed himself against the dirt, holding Rift close. The creature's scales pulsed faintly, almost like it was trying to blend into the shadows. For now, they were hidden. But Cale knew it wouldn't last. Those ships, that armor, it all screamed trouble bigger than he'd ever faced. He looked down at Rift, its glowing eyes meeting his. What did I get myself into? He murmured. The creature nudged his hand, a small gesture that felt strangely like trust. The wind howled overhead, carrying the sound of the hunter's footsteps. Cale gripped his pry bar tighter. He was a scavenger, not a fighter, but he'd be damned if he let them take Rift without a struggle. Whatever this creature was, it had picked him, or maybe he'd picked it. Either way, their story was just beginning. The ravine's shadows stretched long and thin as the twin sons of Sam of Arcterra sank below the horizon. Cale Torrin crouched low, his breath shallow, the weight of Rift pressing against his side. The alien creature's scales shimmered faintly, catching the last glimmers of light, but its glow was weaker now, dulled by exhaustion and injury. Cale's hands ached from dragging the harness, his muscles screaming for rest, but he couldn't stop, not with those armored figures scouring the wreck behind them. The hum of their scanners buzzed in the air, a constant reminder of how close they were. Cale adjusted his grip on the pry bar, his only weapon, and listened. The voices had faded slightly, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of boots on sand. They were spreading out, methodical, like hunters who knew their prey couldn't have gone far. He glanced at Rift. The creature's green eyes met his, sharp and alert despite the pain. Cale couldn't shake the feeling that Rift understood more than it let on, like it was waiting for him to decide their next move. We can't stay here, Cale whispered, more to himself than to Rift. The ravine offered temporary cover, but it was a dead end. Beyond it lay open desert, flat and exposed, with nowhere to hide. He scanned the jagged walls around them, then up at the darkening sky. The black ships still hovered, their engines a low growl against the wind. If he could get Rift to his camp, a half-day's trek from here, he had supplies, a solar-charged skiff, and a chance to figure this out. But moving now meant risking everything. Rift shifted, a soft chirp escaping its throat. The sound was urgent, almost insistent. Cale frowned. You trying to tell me something? He asked, half expecting an answer. Rift's head tilted toward the wreck, then back to him, its claws flexing weakly. Cale's mind raced. Maybe there was something in the ship they could use, something he'd missed in his haste. It was a long shot, but sitting here waiting to be found wasn't an option. He tightened the harness straps and crept back toward the wreck, keeping low. Rift moved with him, its injured leg dragging but its determination clear. The armored figures were still visible, their lights sweeping the dunes, but they hadn't reached the ravine yet. Kale slipped through the smaller tear in the hull, pulling Rift inside. The interior was as he'd left it, charred panels, scattered debris, and the faint hum of dying systems. He scanned the space, searching for anything useful. Near the cockpit, he spotted it, a cracked console flickering with a dim blue glow. Kale knelt beside it, prying open a panel with his bar. Wires sparked, and a small device tumbled out, a handheld unit, alien in design, with symbols he didn't recognize. Rift chirped again, louder this time, its eyes fixed on the device. Kale picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was warm, pulsing faintly, like it was still active. A tracker? A weapon? He had no idea, but Rift's reaction told him it mattered. Before he could study it further, a shout rang out, "Close, too close." Kale stuffed the device into his pack and hauled Rift toward the back exit again. The lights were brighter now, beams cutting through the dusk. He stumbled out of the wreck just as a figure rounded the corner, their scanner locking onto him. "There," the voice barked, guttural and harsh. Kale didn't wait to hear more. He ran, dragging Rift into the open desert, his lungs burning as sand kicked up around them. The skiff was his only hope, a battered, solar-powered rig he'd patched together from scraps. It wasn't fast, but it could outpace boots on foot. He reached the sled he'd abandoned earlier, unhooked the harness, and lifted Rift onto it. The creature was heavy, its scales scraping against the metal, but Kale's adrenaline surged. He climbed aboard, slamming the power switch. The skiff whined to life, its engine coughing before it lurched forward. Behind him, the figures gave chase, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Beams of light streaked past, one sizzling into the sand near the skiff's edge. Energy weapons. Kale swerved, zigzagging to throw off their aim. Rift clung to the sled, its claws digging in, its body low against the jolts. Kale's heart pounded. He didn't know who these hunters were or why they wanted Rift, but he wasn't about to let them win, not after coming this far. The desert stretched endless and dark ahead, the skiff's solar cells useless without sunlight. Kale pushed it harder, draining the battery reserves. His camp was a cluster of tents and crates hidden in a rocky outcrop, a scavenger's haven he'd built over years. If he could reach it, he could hole up, recharge, and plan. The hunters' ships loomed in the distance, but they hadn't taken off yet, maybe they thought he couldn't get far. He was wrong. A sharp whine cut through the night as one of the ships lifted, its shadow racing across the dunes. Kale cursed under his breath, steering toward a narrow canyon he'd mapped months ago. It was tight, too small for a ship to follow, but risky with the skiff's shaky controls. He didn't have a choice. "Hold on, Rift," he muttered, banking hard into the gap. The canyon walls closed in, towering and jagged, the skiff scraping stone as it sped through. The ship's lights flashed overhead, unable to descend, but the ground pursuit was still behind him. Kale's hands shook on the controls, his mind spinning. Rift's chirps grew frantic, its head craning upward. Kale followed its gaze and saw a figure standing on a ledge above, a tall, cloaked shape, watching them. The skiff screeched to a halt as Kale reached the canyon's end, a dead-end cave he'd used for storage. He pulled Rift inside, shoving the sled under a tarp. The cloaked figure descended, moving with a grace that wasn't human. Kale gripped his pry bar, stepping in front of Rift. "Stay back," he warned, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. The figure stopped, raising gloved hands to show they were empty. "You've caused quite a stir, human," they said, their voice smooth and accented, echoing faintly in the cave. They pushed back their hood, revealing a face that wasn't entirely alien, sharp features, silver eyes, and a crest of spines along their scalp. "That creature belongs to me." Kale tightened his grip. "It was dying when I found it. I saved its life. If it's yours, why'd you let it get shot up like that? The figure's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, anger, maybe guilt, crossing their face. I didn't, they said. Others did. They want it dead, and you've just made yourself a target by keeping it alive. Rift growled low, pressing against Kale's leg. The sound wasn't hostile, it was protective. Kale's jaw clenched. Who are you? And who's they? He demanded. The figure stepped closer, their presence commanding despite the dim light. I am Terran Vex, once a lord of the Cryon Dominion. That creature, Rift, you call it, is my bond kin. A rare symbiote, linked to me since birth. My enemies attacked it to weaken me. Kale's mind reeled. A symbiote? Linked? He glanced at Rift, its glowing eyes locked on Terran. There was recognition there, but also wariness. If it's yours, why's it sticking with me? Kale asked, his tone sharp. Terran's lips twitched, almost a smile. It trusts you. You saved it when I couldn't. But trust me, human, you're in over your head. Give it to me, and I'll ensure your safety. Kale didn't budge. I don't hand over friends to strangers who show up with fancy titles and no proof. You want Rift? Convince me you're not the one who heard it. Terran's silver eyes glinted, assessing him. Bold for a scavenger, they said. But you're right to question. The ones chasing you are Cryon enforcers, loyal to a usurper who's taken my throne. They'll kill us both to finish what they started. The cave trembled as the ship's engines roared closer. Kale's pulse raced. He didn't know Terran, didn't trust them, but Rift's steady presence beside him felt like a vote of confidence. If they're after you, why'd they leave Rift alive? He asked. Terran's expression darkened. To lure me here. A trap. They didn't expect a human to interfere. Kale snorted. Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises. So what now? You gonna fight them off, or am I stuck babysitting your pet while you run? Terran's spines flared slightly, a sign of irritation. We fight together, or we die separately, they said. Your choice. Rift nudged Kale's hand, its scales pulsing brighter. Kale exhaled hard. He'd wanted a quiet life, not a galactic standoff. But something about Rift, about Terran's story, sparked a fire in him, a stubborn, human refusal to back down. Fine, he said, slinging his pack over his shoulder. But we do this my way. I've got a skiff, some tricks, and a camp not far off. Let's move. Terran nodded, a grudging respect in their gaze. The enforcer's light swept closer, and the cave walls shook. Kale led the way, Rift at his side, Terran following. He didn't know if he'd just made an ally or an enemy, but one thing was clear, the quiet days of scavenging were over. The desert night stretched ahead, alive with danger and possibility. The cave trembled as the Cryon enforcers closed in, their ships casting long shadows across the canyon walls. Kale Torin moved fast, leading Rift and Terran Vex deeper into the rocky outcrop. The air was thick with dust, the rumble of engines vibrating through the ground. His camp wasn't far, a hidden nook he'd carved out over years of scavenging, stocked with enough gear to survive Arctera's harsh seasons. If they could reach it, they might stand a chance. Rift limped beside him, its scales flickering with faint light, while Terran followed close behind, their silver eyes scanning the darkness. Kale's mind churned as he ran. Terran's story about usurpers and symbiotes sounded wild, but Rift's trust in him, and its wariness of Terran, kept him on edge. He didn't know who to believe, but he'd seen the enforcers' weapons, felt their intent. Whatever Rift was, it was worth killing for, and Kale wasn't about to let that happen. Not after he'd patched it up, hauled it across the desert, and dodged energy blasts to keep it safe. They reached the camp just as the first ship swooped low, its searchlights slicing through the night. Kale yanked a tarp aside, revealing a cluster of crates, a solar panel array, and his skiff, still dented from the canyon run. Inside, he barked, shoving Rift toward a narrow crevice between the rocks. The creature obeyed, squeezing into the shadowed space, its scales dimming to blend with the stone. Terran hesitated, their crest of spines twitching, but followed Kale's lead as he ducked behind a stack of salvaged metal. The enforcers landed moments later, their boots thudding against the sand. Kale peeked out, counting 6 figures, tall, armored, their faces hidden behind visors. They moved with precision, fanning out to surround the camp. One raised a scanner, its red beam sweeping over the crates. Kale's stomach tightened. He'd rigged the camp with a few tricks, motion sensors, a makeshift EMP pulse, but nothing strong enough to take down a squad like this. Terran crouched beside him, their voice low. "They'll find us soon. We need to strike first." Kale shot them a look. "With what?" "I've got a pry bar and some junk." "You got a secret army in that cloak?" Terran's lips twitched, a flicker of amusement breaking their stern expression. "No army," they said, pulling the small device Kale had salvaged from the wreck out of his pack. "But this might help." Kale frowned. "What is it?" Terran's fingers danced over the alien symbols, and the device hummed to life, projecting a faint holographic map. "A distress beacon," they explained. "Linked to my ship, or what's left of it. If I activate it, my loyalists might pick up the signal." Kale raised an eyebrow. "Might? That's a big gamble." Terran met his gaze, unflinching. "Better than dying here, human." Before Kale could argue, the scanner beam locked onto their position. "Target acquired," one of the enforcers shouted, raising a weapon. Kale acted on instinct, grabbing a fist-sized rock and hurling it at the nearest crate. It hit a hidden tripwire, triggering a burst of sparks from a rigged battery pack. The enforcers flinched, momentarily blinded, and Kale seized the chance. "Do it," he hissed at Terran. Terran pressed the device, and a sharp pulse rippled through the air, the hologram flaring bright before fading. Kale didn't know if it worked, but he wasn't waiting to find out. He lunged for the skiff, yanking a tarp off a salvaged plasma cutter he'd modified into a crude turret. It wasn't much, barely functional, but it could buy time. He fired, a jagged bolt of energy sizzling toward the enforcers. 2 dove for cover, but the others returned fire, beams scorching the rocks around him. Rift growled from the crevice, its scales flaring brighter. Kale glanced back and saw the creature struggling to stand, its green eyes locked on the fight. "Stay down," he yelled, but Rift ignored him, dragging itself forward. Before Kale could stop it, the creature lunged, slamming into an enforcer with surprising force. The armored figure staggered, and Rift's claws raked across their chest, sparking against the metal. Terran moved too, darting out with a blade Kale hadn't noticed before, a sleek, curved thing that glowed faintly. They fought with a fluid grace, taking down another enforcer in seconds. Kale kept the turret firing, his hands shaking but his aim steady. For a moment, it looked like they might hold their own. Then the ship overhead opened fire, a heavy blast cratering the sand near the skiff. Kale dove for cover, dragging Rift back as the ground shook. Terran rolled beside him, breathing hard. "We can't win this," they said, their voice tight. "Not alone." Kale gritted his teeth. "We're not dead yet." He scrambled to the crates, pulling out a coil of wire and a power cell. If he could rig the solar array to overload, it might disrupt the ship's sensors long enough for them to slip away. He worked fast, sweat stinging his eyes, while Terran kept the enforcers at bay. Rift stayed close, its presence oddly calming despite the chaos. Kale connected the wires, his fingers fumbling but sure. He'd built worse under pressure, once turned a broken hover rig into a flare launcher to scare off raiders. This had to work. The array sparked as he flipped the switch, a surge of energy crackling upward. The ship's lights flickered, its engines stuttering. "Now!" Kale shouted, grabbing Rift and sprinting for the skiff. Terran followed, and they piled in, the sled groaning under their weight. Kale slammed the controls, and the skiff shot forward, weaving through the rocks as the enforcers recovered. They didn't get far before a new sound cut through the night, a deep, resonant hum, different from the enforcers' ships. Kale looked up and saw it, a sleek vessel dropping from the clouds, its hull shimmering like liquid metal. Terran's eyes widened. "My loyalists," they breathed. They came. The new ship opened fire, not on them but on the enforcers. Beams of light clashed in the sky, and the ground squad scattered. Kale kept the skiff moving, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and suspicion. "Friends of yours?" he asked Terran. They nodded, but their expression was grim. "Yes. And they've brought someone with them." The ship landed ahead, its ramp lowering as Kale slowed the skiff. A figure emerged, tall, regal, draped in a flowing robe that shimmered like rift scales. Their face was alien, with high cheekbones and eyes that glowed a deeper green than rifts. They moved with authority, flanked by two guards in lighter armor. Terran tensed beside Kale, their hand tightening on the blade. "Lord Varen," Terran said, stepping forward. "You're alive." The figure, Varen, smiled faintly, but it didn't reach their eyes. "As are you, Terran. And my bond kin." Their gaze shifted to Rift, who chirped softly but didn't move from Kale's side. Kale's gut twisted. This was the Baron Terran had hinted at, the true owner of Rift, or so it seemed. Varen approached, their presence commanding silence. "You've kept it safe," they said to Kale, their voice smooth and melodic. "A human, no less." "Impressive." Kale didn't relax. "It's not an it. It's Rift. And I didn't do it for you." Varen's smile widened, a flicker of curiosity in their eyes. "Bold words. But you've stepped into a war you don't understand." Terran cut in, their tone sharp. "The usurper's enforcers attacked us. They're tracking Rift to finish you, Varen. This human saved it, and me." Varen's gaze softened slightly, but Kale caught a glint of something else, calculation, maybe doubt. "Then we owe him a debt," Varen said. "But the Cryon Dominion is fractured. My exile ends here, and I need Rift to reclaim what's mine." Kale stepped between Varen and Rift, his voice firm. "Rift's not a tool. It's hurt, and it trusts me. You want it back. Prove you're not just another tyrant throwing it into a fight." Varen's guards bristled, but the Lord raised a hand, stopping them. "A scavenger with a conscience," Varen mused. "Rare. Very well, human, Kale, is it? Join us. Help me end this, and Rift stays with you until it chooses otherwise." Kale hesitated. He didn't trust Varen, not fully, but the enforcers were still out there, and Terran's loyalists offered protection he couldn't match alone. Rift nudged his leg, its scales pulsing gently, and Kale exhaled. "Fine. But I'm not your soldier. I'm here for Rift." Varen nodded, a spark of respect in their eyes. "Agreed. For now." The ship's ramp beckoned, and Kale followed, Rift at his side, Terran trailing behind. The desert fell silent as they boarded, the enforcers retreating under the loyalists' fire. Kale didn't know what lay ahead, but he felt the weight of it, a war, a bond, and a choice he couldn't undo. Human stubbornness had carried him this far. Now, it would carry him into the stars. The sleek hull of Lord Varen's ship hummed around Kale Torin as it cut through the void, leaving Arctera's dusty plains far behind. The interior was a stark contrast to the desert, polished walls that shimmered like rift scales, soft lights pulsing in rhythm with the engines, and a quiet that felt heavy with purpose. Kale stood near a viewport, watching the stars streak by, his hand resting on Rift's head. The creature's breathing was steady now, its injuries healing under the care of Varen's advanced medics, but its green eyes stayed fixed on Kale, a silent anchor in the chaos. Terran Vex leaned against a nearby console, their silver gaze flickering between Kale and Varen, who stood at the ship's command center, issuing orders in a melodic alien tongue. The Loyalists, Varen's remaining followers, moved with disciplined efficiency, preparing for something big. Kale didn't need to understand the language to feel the tension. They were flying into a fight, and he'd been dragged along with them, a scavenger turned reluctant ally in a war he barely grasped. Varen approached, their robe trailing like liquid starlight. "We're nearing the Cryon Fringe," they said, their voice calm but edged with steel. "The usurper's stronghold lies there. With Rift, I can challenge their claim and end this rebellion." Kale's jaw tightened. "And if Rift doesn't want to fight your war?" he asked, his tone blunt. Varen's eyes narrowed, but they didn't snap back. "It's not about want, Kale. It's about need. Rift and I are bound, its strength is mine, and mine is its. Without it, I'm vulnerable." Kale glanced at Rift, who chirped softly, pressing closer to his leg. "Doesn't sound like a partnership," he said. "Sounds like you're using it." Terran shifted, a flicker of unease crossing their face, but Varen only smiled, a thin, knowing curve of their lips. "You humans see bonds differently," they replied. "For us, it's survival. But I'll honor our deal. Rift stays with you until it chooses." The ship shuddered, cutting the conversation short. Alarms blared, and a loyalist shouted from the helm, "Enemy vessels detected." Kale braced himself as the viewport filled with the sight of angular black ships, the same design as the Enforcer's crafts on Arcterra, but larger, bristling with weapons. Varen's expression hardened. "They've tracked us," they said. "Ready the defenses." Kale wasn't a soldier, but he'd survived enough scrapes to know when to act. He grabbed Rift and followed Terran to a side chamber, where the Loyalists were arming turrets and prepping drones. "Stay out of this," Terran warned, handing him a small communicator. "Keep Rift safe. We'll handle the fight." Kale shook his head. "I'm not hiding while you take the hits. Give me something to do." Terran hesitated, then tossed him a control pad. "Auxiliary systems," they said. "You're a scavenger, figure it out." Kale grinned despite the tension, his fingers already working the unfamiliar tech. He'd hacked worse on Arcterra, old rigs with half their circuits fried. This was alien, sure, but systems were systems. He patched into the ship's power grid, rerouting energy to boost the shields as the first enemy volley struck. The ship rocked, metal groaning under the impact. Rift growled, its scales flaring bright, and Kale felt a strange warmth pulse through him, like the creature was urging him on. He didn't question it, focusing instead on the pad. The shields held, but barely. "They're targeting the engines," he called to Terran, who relayed it to Varen. The Lord's voice cut through the chaos, ordering evasive maneuvers, but the enemy ships were relentless, closing in like a pack of wolves. Kale's mind raced. He wasn't trained for this, but he'd always been good at improvising. He scanned the ship's layout, spotting a cluster of maintenance drones docked near the hull. "Terran," he shouted. "Can those drones carry a charge?" Terran's spines twitched. "Yes, but they're not armed." Kale's grin widened. "They don't need to be." He hacked the drone controls, overriding their safety protocols, a trick he'd learned stripping old mining bots. With a few tweaks, he linked them to a spare power cell from the ship's reserves, turning them into flying bombs. "Get me a clear shot," he told Terran. They relayed the order, and the ship banked hard, exposing the enemy's flank. Kale launched the drones, guiding them straight into the nearest enemy vessel. The explosion lit up the void, a fireball tearing through the black ship's hull. The Loyalists cheered, but Kale didn't stop, sending the next wave at a second target. The enemy faltered, their formation breaking as Varen's ship pressed the advantage. Rift's scales pulsed brighter, and Kale felt that warmth again, stronger, like a heartbeat syncing with his own. "You helping me out?" he muttered, half joking. Rift chirped, its eyes gleaming. The battle shifted, but the usurper's flagship loomed ahead, a massive craft dwarfing the rest. Varen strode to Kael's side, their presence commanding even amid the chaos. "We need Rift now," they said. "Its energy can amplify our weapons, end this quickly." Kael stepped in front of the creature, his voice firm. "You don't get to decide that. Rift's not a battery." Varen's eyes flashed, but before they could argue, the flagship fired, a beam of raw energy that slammed into the ship. The deck buckled, throwing Kael and Rift against the wall. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he scrambled up, pulling Rift close. Terran staggered over, blood trickling from a cut on their brow. "They're boarding," they gasped. "We're out of time." Kael's heart pounded as the ship's corridors filled with the sound of boots and weapons fire. Loyalists rushed to defend, but the enemy was inside, armored enforcers like the ones on Arcterra, only more of them. Varen drew a glowing blade, joining the fight, but Kael knew they couldn't hold long. He dragged Rift to a maintenance hatch, his mind spinning for a way out. Inside the cramped tunnel, he found what he needed, a junction box tied to the ship's core systems. "If I can't stop them outside, I'll stop them in here," he muttered. Rift nudged him, its scales flaring, and Kael felt that pulse again, stronger, clearer, like a shared thought. He didn't understand it, but he trusted it. He rigged the box to overload, linking it to the ship's comms array. If he timed it right, the blast would fry the enemy's tech without killing everyone aboard. He worked fast, sweat dripping into his eyes, Rift's presence steady beside him. The tunnel shook as fighting raged outside, shouts, blasts, the clash of metal. Kael finished the rig, setting a short delay, and grabbed Rift. "Time to move," he said, crawling back toward the chamber. They emerged just as Varen and Terran fell back, cornered by enforcers. Kael hit the trigger, and the ship jolted as the junction blew. Lights flickered, and the enemy's weapons sparked, shorting out. The Loyalists seized the moment, pushing the enforcers back. Varen's blade flashed, cutting through the last of them, and silence fell, broken only by the hum of the damaged ship. The flagship retreated, its hull scarred from the drones, its boarding party defeated. Varen turned to Kael, breathing hard. "You did that?" they asked, disbelief in their tone. Kael shrugged, wincing at his bruised shoulder. "Scavenger tricks. Comes in handy." Rift chirped, nudging his hand, and Varen's gaze softened. "You're more than you seem, Kael Torin," they said. Rift chose well. Kael met their eyes, steady despite the ache in his bones. "It's not about choosing sides. It's about doing what's right." Varen nodded, a rare hint of respect breaking their regal mask. "Then stay with us. The fringe is ours again, but the usurper lives. This isn't over." Terran stepped forward, wiping blood from their face. "You've got a place here, human. You've earned it." Kael looked at Rift, its scales glowing softly, and felt that warmth again, not just from the creature, but from something deeper, something human. He'd started this to save a stray. Now, he was part of something bigger. "All right," he said, slinging his pack over his good shoulder. "But I'm not calling you Lord anything." Varen laughed, a real, unguarded sound, and Terran smirked. The ship turned toward the stars, its crew battered but unbroken. Kael stood with Rift, watching the galaxy unfold, a scavenger no more but a man who'd found his fight. The story didn't end there. The usurper was out there, plotting, and the Cryon dominion hung in the balance. Kael didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing, with Rift at his side and his wits sharp, he'd face it head-on. Humanity didn't back down, not now, not ever.